The Dow Jones Industrial Average is above 12,000 for the 8th day in a row. And that's just one of the reasons some, including yesterday's Freedom Watch guest, Greg Ip from The Economist magazine, think that the economy is on the right track. But is it really? Unemployment is still at 9%, and food and energy prices are rising, and some people are leaving the workforce because they haven't found jobs in 2 years. Here now is the less optimistic and, in my view, more realistic view, Jerry Salenti, publisher of Trends Journal. Jerry, welcome here.
Thank
you. Yesterday, The Economist magazine, nice fellow looking at the same statistics that you and I look at, says happy days are here again and things are going well. What say you?
By their deeds you shall know them. The Economist magazine, if I recall, in 2000 said that oil prices would go down to $5 a barrel. And so I don't look at their forecast with very high regard.
All right.
Because the fact is, we're looking at an unemployment rate at what? We had created 36,000 jobs in January, and they were supposed to create 147,000 jobs, and we need to create 150,000 jobs a month.
How accurate is the statistic that says that unemployment is hovering around 9 to 9.4%? Aren't there people who've just stopped looking for jobs? Isn't it really worse than that?
Well, in the USSA, it's like the former Soviet Union. They're cooking the numbers. Once you're off the unemployment rolls, you're no longer counted. John Williams, Shadow Statistics, he's putting the unemployment rate at around 22%. And again, when we look at the numbers, and that's all we'll talk about.
Right.
I heard President Obama say they created 1 million jobs last year in 2010, U.S. companies. No, they didn't. They created 2.5 million. The only problem is they sent 1.5 million of them overseas where they created.
Right.
At the current rate that they're creating jobs now, again, we have to create 150,000 a month.
All right. How bad will things be if the debt, which is now $14.3 trillion, goes up to $15.8 trillion? The president wants to borrow another $1.5 trillion. Most of the Congress will let him do it. And we keep spending 70% of what we take in on entitlements and defense. And interest payments.
How about if you have a second mortgage and you take out a third? That's what they're doing to this country. They're bankrupting us in front of our eyes by this devaluation of the dollar, printing digital money not worth the paper it's not printed on. We found out because of the one-time reporting in the Dodd-Frank bill that the Federal Reserve shoveled under the table $20 trillion worth of deals at no interest and low interest rates to banks around the world.
Well, Ron Paul is right then when he says the Federal Reserve spends more than the Congress does. $20 trillion.
$20 trillion in deals to the Bank of Japan, banks in Switzerland, in Germany, in France, in Ireland, giving money, no interest loans, low interest loans to General Electric, to McDonald's, to Harley-Davidson.
Last question. Why should the average person be concerned about that? The average American?
Because why do you think gasoline prices, all these commodity prices, food prices are going at record levels? They're commodity based in dollars. The more dollar gets devalued, the higher the cost of living goes up. But again, according to the USSA, there's no inflation going on. It's all in your mind.
Jerry, thanks very much for joining us. Coming up, the GOP's new plan for making Obamacare null and void. And could you soon be paying for your neighbor's hybrid car? All that and more when we return with my freedom fighters next. Healthcare repeal may have failed in the Senate, but the GOP refuses to give up on throwing out Obamacare once and for all. Its new strategy, defund the healthcare law. And that's exactly what Republicans in the House hope to do next week. Here to discuss are my freedom fighters, Fox Business Network correspondent and my colleague Dennis Neal, New York Post columnist Kirsten Powers, and Mises Institute chair Lou Rockwell. Do the Republicans have a chance of pulling this off?
I don't think they do, really. I'm not sure some of the machinations of how that works in there. But what's great is that they are galvanizing more attention. You now see a health care bill that, despite its good intentions, is now under siege in the courts. It is under siege in Congress, where half of Congress has voted to wipe it out. And now it's under siege in spending. And it's a classic move. But remember the old days of presidential impoundment? Kind of nice to see Congress trying its own hand at impounding funds, in essence.
Interestingly put, that's a very famous case when President Nixon tried to impound funds. Lou, do the Republicans really want to defund Obamacare? Are they really trying to do this? or is it all political because they know they won't succeed and they want to look good with the base back home?
Well, Judge, I'm afraid outside of the Ron Paulians that the Republicans do not want to do it. After all, much of this bill is a subsidy to the pharmaceutical industry, and all these guys, Boehner and Cantor and Paul Ryan and the rest of them, were all for Bushacare in the last administration, which was also a big subsidy to the pharmaceutical industry. On the other hand, this shows that if Congress wanted to balance the budget, if they actually wanted to cut and do this country some good, the House of Representatives could do it by itself.
Right.
They could actually cut the budget, balance the budget immediately.
But you as a libertarian and I would be happy if they found some way to undo it, not to pay for it, because it's less government regulation, less borrowing, and less spending, right?
Judge, would be just a dream. It would be magnificent. It would signal the whole world that America was serious about fixing our problems.
All right, Kirsten, I see your blood pressure going up. Are we stuck with Obamacare? Can the Republicans in the House not pay for it? Will it go away? Or is the federal government going to tell me my doctor has to use their laptop so that they know what I'm telling him?
Oh, now that sounds like a conspiracy theory right there, Judge. I'm hoping that it's not going to go anywhere. It doesn't seem that it's going to go anywhere. And I have to say, politically, I do not understand what the Republicans are doing here. It's been 30 days of, nothing really related to jobs. After all of the screaming and yelling, where are the jobs? Where are the jobs? Rightfully so, in my opinion. It just seems like they have a real tin ear politically
Kirsten,
to be wasting time on this stuff.
Here's the Republican argument. Government doesn't create jobs. The private sector does. And every dollar that is not taken from the private sector by the government is a dollar out there that could be invested. So if they can shrink the government, I don't know that all of them believe this. I think Lou is right. Only the libertarians do. But if they can shrink the government and take less money, private enterprise will create more jobs. Do you disagree with that?
Well, the thing is, if we're just talking about health care, part of the point of health care reform was to try to reduce costs of health care. And the CBO says that over the long term that this would reduce the deficit. So actually, I don't think that really holds water. And more importantly, they're not going to be able to repeal it, Judge. You and I both know that.
All right,
so they're just playing political games at a very critical time in history where we really need to get things in order.
While they're playing games,
Judge,
you might think they're playing games, but let's remember the CBO. What if they're just wrong? When we passed the first part of Medicare, guys, in 1965, they said by 1990 it would cost $9 billion a year. It cost $67 billion. Anytime you give more coverage, utilization goes up. That is terrifying small business people. I've talked to guys who say, I don't want a tax cut to hire people. I want to know what my health care costs are going to be for my employees.
Should the Republicans be trying to do this,
Office,
Lou?
The CBO judges the Congressional Baloney Office. You can't believe anything they say. I mean, are people actually arguing that you want to cut costs, put the government in charge? I mean, give me one example of the cost the government has ever cut ever in the history of the world. It's never happened.
All right. Switching gears a little bit, team. In its budget proposal for next year, the Obama administration will propose a $7,500 tax credit for hybrid cars. I wonder if we know anybody in this group that's used it. It's money the feds don't have for cars we don't want. And even if the feds weren't broke, is it really the government's job to incentivize certain lifestyle choices, Kirsten Powers?
Speak for yourself. Cars we don't want. I drive a Prius and I love it. And I think everybody should drive a Prius.
But did you get the Prius using the government giveaway?
There actually was a tax credit when I bought it. I don't think it was quite as large as what they're talking about right now, but I did get a tax credit for it. I know that my husband would like to. He has a Lexus right now that he would like to get the Lexus hybrid. I'm sure that we would love to have the tax credit for that. Look,
right.
And so, look, if it's a great product and you really love it, there shouldn't have to be some kind of government subsidy. I keep seeing ads for the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf is the car of the year, and yet the government's got to pay me $7,500 to want to buy that contraption. You know, the way we're going to solve the green thing is to make great products that are more convenient and cheaper and safe.
We have to remember that one of Obama's big donors.
Go ahead, Lou.
One of Obama's big donors makes electric cars, so this is a political payoff. On the other hand, I find it hard to be against any loophole. Loopholes are great, but by the way, if we're interested in energy-efficient automobiles, why are all the turbo diesels from Europe blocked by the U.S. government? Why can't we have the those
right, Lou,
diesels, which are far more energy efficient than the Prius.
I suspect that you and I share a little bit of ambivalence about tax credits, because a tax credit means you pay less money on your tax bill. The government collects less money, and that's a good thing because it's more money in your pocket. But when the tax credit is used to induce behavior on your part that the government prefers, a choice that individuals should make and not the government, that's the abuse.
But
right,
we do
Lou?
that all the time, don't we?
But,
Well,
Judge,
but it is
can I say
typical, of
something?
course. That's
Go
right.
ahead, Kirsten.
But I want to say something. It's, one of the guests was saying, if it's such a great product, it actually is an excellent product. The difference is it's a little more expensive. It's more expensive to buy a hybrid. So some people might not buy a hybrid because it's a little more expensive.
But the
even
free
though
market
they
should take
want
care
to.
of that. And when it's cheap enough, we will buy it.
And if we have an interest in cutting down on pollution, forget global warming. Just cutting down on pollution, which we do. If we have an interest on getting off of oil, which we do, I think that the government should be trying to
I have nothing
encourage.
against.
There's nothing
I have
wrong with
nothing
oil.
against
Oil
these
is great.
cars,
Come on,
Kirsten,
let's
but-
not be anti-oil here.
All right, but, Kirsten,
Oil
how-
is great. What are we, protectionists?
How-
we love
how-
it. Oil is great.
How can the government decide, Kirsten, what product it wants to subsidize and what product it wants to be free to compete with its competitors? Shouldn't the government not be in that business of subsidizing products that it likes or wants us to use?
But, Judge, you don't think the government should really be involved in anything. So I don't think that that's really a fair question. If you're coming from the perspective that I'm coming from,
Right.
I don't have a problem with this because I think
how do
the
they
government,
decide they're paid
the
off is how
government
they
does
decide.
have an interest. The government does have an interest, for example, in reducing pollution. Do you disagree with that? I mean, do you think it's okay that like in New York City, that there are certain areas of the city where overwhelmingly the children suffer from asthma because of pollution? You think the government should just say, whatever?
The
Lou, I'll give
U.S.
you the-
mili-
I'll
the
give you
U.S.
the last
military
word.
is the biggest
Rockwell.
polluter in the world. How about cutting down that pollution? I notice no liberal talks about that.
All right.
What?
Dennis.
I can't.
Well, look,
didn't hear that.
haven't we always used tax policy to give incentives to certain kinds of behavior? When we provide tax incentives for research and development, it's because we want to unlock innovation, and I think that's a good thing. I think we should do more with tax incentives in Obamacare. We ought to give hospitals tax credits to open up cheap clinics for people with colds so the poor people don't come in.
Gotta go. Rockwell,
but the-
Powers, Neil, thank you very much for joining us. Great group. We'll have you back
Thank you,
soon. Up next, the plain truth on the Federal Reserve. Even Kirsten Powers wants to hear this, and the value of your money. Does the government work for us, or do we exist to serve the government? Are the freedoms that are guaranteed in the Constitution truly guarantees, or can the Congress give away its constitutional authority to coin money to private bankers? Tonight, your money and your freedom and the Federal Reserve. For 140 years, with two brief exceptions, the people of the United States of America and the federal government existed quite well without a central bank. Two presidents who understood human liberty and the dangers of giving power to central bankers, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, rid us of the first and the second national banks. From 1776 to 1913, when the American dollar was backed by gold, when the government coined and printed the money, and when there was no bank to manipulate the money supply or interest rates, the value of the dollar rose by 8%. That's hard to understand for those of us who were not around before 1913, because we have all grown up and lived in a society in which the value of the dollar has gone down as prices have gone up. But it is true, though there were bank runs and some panics, though there was, of course, a civil war and an illegal income tax, for the most part, in those 140 years, the dollar stayed sound, and it actually had greater purchasing power in 1913, right before the Federal Reserve came into existence, than it did in 1776 when the country was founded. The reason for that was the growth of the money supply. The number of dollars in banks and in circulation was a function of the free market, of individual risk and loss and gain, and not caused by an edict from the government or from a central bank. And all cash was backed by gold. In the 98 years since the creation of the Fed, we've experienced the opposite from what existed in the years before. Today, the dollar buys 92% less than it did in 1913. Though many will argue over the causes for that, there are clearly two: the loss of the gold standard and the flooding of the market with cash, printed by the Federal Reserve. Today, the money supply grows not because of real increases in wealth, but because the Fed creates money out of thin air that does not need to be backed by gold. This is true. Until a few years ago, when the federal government needed cash, it called up the Fed and asked for it. Even though the Constitution says that Congress shall coin money, Congress has given away that power to the bankers at the Fed. The Fed then prints the money and loans it to the federal government. Today, the Fed no longer uses or needs a printing press. It's the digital age. It merely adds zeros to the accounts of member banks, and they lend that newly created cash out of thin air to the federal government. The result, of course, is that the government has the cash with which to pay its bills. It gets to pay its bills with dollars that are worth less than the dollars were worth when it incurred its bills. And it doesn't need to raise taxes. And all this can be done quietly and electronically. But that's only half the story. The other half is that the amount of money in banks and in circulation grows by the amount created that the Fed has loaned to the government. That doesn't constitute wealth. Remember, the government cannot create wealth. It just consumes wealth. All the extra cash being spent on the same number of goods and services is the classic definition of inflation. It is the cruelest tax of all, and there is no way around it. So all this government borrowing of money and the Fed creation of cash raises the prices of everything. As well, all the money that the Fed created and loaned to the federal government needs to be paid back. And that creates the obligation on the part of the government to pay interest. That forces future generations to raise taxes needed to pay that interest. And of course, when the loans are due and the government can't pay them back, it just borrows more money. That's how we've gotten into this mess. A mess where your government owes over $14 trillion that it doesn't have. A mess where your grandmother could buy 9 times what you can with $1. A mess where the solution of the president and the big government Republicans is to borrow more money. And to make matters worse, the Fed won't tell us what it is up to. Enter Congressman Ron Paul. First, he wants to examine the Fed's books, and then he wants to shut it down. Every day, more Americans can see how correct his arguments are. This time, he might just make them happen. Tomorrow, the battle between libertarian and social conservatives. Governor Sarah Palin, Governor Mike Huckabee, right here on Freedom Watch. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. So long, America.